So our first question was going to be, help me out, Shannon, the one we wanted to lead off with.
We were going to lead off with what brought about the actual aircraft in the first place.
Yeah.
Take it from there?
Yeah.
Right, I'll take it from there. The Royal Air Force had a requirement for a long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft to protect the sea lanes. This had been a standing requirement from the 1920s, and this was just the natural extension of that requirement as we moved towards the Second World War.
Great. And how many companies were involved in, you mentioned developing prototypes to win the contracts?
The actual number of companies I don't have immediately to hand, but the principle was that you would submit a specification to a number of likely companies, and you would then examine the specifications, make a short list, or possibly ask them to produce a prototype, and then those companies would fly off the aircraft, successful aircraft receiving the contract.
And the Sunderland came into being around about?
In the late 30s.
Okay. This particular aircraft served with how many nations and in what role?
The aircraft was always used as a maritime reconnaissance aircraft with the British, the Australians, the New Zealanders and the French.
And with the British, it served with the Royal Air Force?
With the Royal Air Force, yes.
And it was primarily put into use in the areas of just the United Kingdom, or?
No, this aircraft was used throughout the world. We operated both in United Kingdom, North Atlantic waters, we operated off West Africa, in the South Atlantic, and in the Far East in the Indian Ocean.
Where in particular in the South Atlantic?
They operated from Bathurst, West Africa, to protect the vulnerable southern shipping lanes from U-boat attacks.
The primary role of this aircraft during the war was to?
Basically to keep the sea lanes open, an anti-submarine and reconnaissance aircraft. The Germans had a number of surface raiders, but the greatest risk and the greatest threat came from their submarine force.
When this aircraft came into being, was radar part of its equipment?
Not the early models, but by the time the Mark V, which is the aircraft behind me, came into service, yes, radar was a part of their equipment fit.
And how effective was the radar in locating the submarines?
That really very much depends on the parameters of the weather, the sea state. It could be pretty effective and it could be almost of no use at all, but that's probably true of current maritime reconnaissance aircraft.
Okay. Shannon, any thoughts as we're
Well, I'm particularly interested in the design of the keel, and just you mentioned earlier about the anti-corrosive treatment on the outside. Can you explain a little bit about
The flying boat design really is exactly what it says it is. It's a boat that flies. So you've got to make a compromise, and much of the effort of every nation that has produced flying boats has gone into the design of the hull, the keel that you see behind me. It has to be an efficient boat, but equally it also has to compromise and be a reasonably efficient aerodyne. This craft was perhaps the pinnacle of British development of that design effort, and I've lost the train of my thought.
The anti-corrosive?
I'm
treatment.
sorry. The aircraft was treated for salt corrosion because it operated at low to medium altitude over the sea lanes. This had an unexpected beneficial effect in that when the Berlin airlift started in 1948, we were able to use these flying boats for a short period of time to bring salt into Berlin, taking off from sites near Hamburg and landing on the lakes in Berlin.
It's amazing that when the camera goes on, everybody goes blank, isn't it? I should have really brought a notepad with me today. The crew complement of this aircraft. Are you familiar with that?
I'd have to tell you to go around and read the caption.
That's fine.
Are you familiar with the fact that this aircraft was called the Flying Porcupine?
The aircraft was called the Flying Porcupine, yes indeed, for the very reason that it had so many defensive weapons on it. Machine gun turret in the nose and the tail, fixed machine guns in the nose. You could fit beam machine guns in the side hatches. It was bristling with armament.
The nose cannon, the fixed nose cannon, were they operated by the pilot?
The fixed machine guns in the nose were indeed operated by the pilot. The intention was, as you came in to attack the U-boat, as the German crew would often scramble to the anti-aircraft defences. As you were pointing your aircraft at the target, then the pilot could then fire the forward fixed machine guns and kill or disable or at least cause them to lower their heads long enough for him to get into a position for the depth charge attack to be made.
So it was a depth charge, not a torpedo that they dropped?
Depth charges, yes. We started the war with anti-submarine bombs, but it's extremely difficult to hit a moving surface target. We then moved to depth charges because inevitably submarines will crash dive when they see an aircraft. Go down, go deep, and then try and manoeuvre out of the way. The depth charge became the standard piece of anti-submarine equipment, both on aircraft and on surface vessels.
So, the primary role of this aircraft was for hunting submarines.
Yes.
And if you can restate my question as you answer, how successful was the Sunderland in hunting submarines and actually taking out submarines?
The Sunderland, together with the American Catalina, was one of the most successful submarine hunters of the Second World War.
And any idea as far as the number of kills that may be accredited to the submarine, the Sunderland?
No.
Right. Tell us about the unique design of the forward turret. It seems like it's recessed.
The forward turret, in fact, is a standard piece of equipment. What it has, however, got the capability of is to be drawn back into the hull. Because when you land this flying boat, you need to moor it. So you need to be in the prow of the boat, and that is what you can see behind me. The crew are about to catch the mooring buoy and moor the aircraft.
How were the mooring buoys anchored? I mean, in shallow water, were they just chained?
They're just chain anchors. Mooring buoys are just chain anchors in shallow water. The problem with that often is that, of course, that is an area which is caught in storms. If you have your flying boats moored close into the shore, if the prevailing wind is onshore and there is a storm, the flying boat is driven onto the rocks. And all nations have lost flying boats by that means.
What's the range, the distance range?
Go to the data panel again. Go to the data panel.
We were going to talk about that particular piece of trivia.
The trivia about how many
Oh, yes.
people can you fit in?
Fit onto a Sunderland flying boat. Bring me that microphone down. Okay. So, you were going to tell us about this unique piece of trivia.
Well, of many of the exploits of the Sunderland, perhaps the most unusual was as a transport aircraft during the evacuation from Crete in 1941. These aircraft were landed on the sea next to the southern shore of Crete, and nearly 100 service personnel were taken on board and flown to Egypt. Now, you will have seen through the camera lens the size of the interior, and although it is large, one has to ask the question, where do you put 100 people?
At what point did the Sunderland discontinue use with the RAF?
As we moved into the post-war period, the Sunderland was used both, as I said earlier, in the Berlin airlift, but then again during the Korean War in the Far East. But as time moved on and we moved into the 50s, the aircraft type was becoming obsolete. Land planes were replacing it. So by the end of the 50s, the flying boat had had its day.
Now, in some of the smaller countries, Scandinavian, New Zealand, I believe they did continue on into the 60s.
Flying boats continue to operate throughout the world. They're usually used in the more inaccessible areas. When we talk about North America, we talk about the Canadian Lakes area. When we look towards the Pacific, the islands, the hundreds of thousands of islands, need some sort of communication, and certainly immediately after the Second World War, flying boats had a renaissance for civilian transport use in the Pacific.
The actual military Sunderlands quite often were converted, is that correct, into Sunderland?
In 1945, at the end of the war, there were vast surplus stocks of both land planes and flying boats. Both were converted for civilian use.
Do you know how many Sunderlands were manufactured?
I believe the answer to that question is just under 1,000.
And today there are remaining?
I can only think of 3.
Actually, I believe there's 4. This one, Duxford.
You're absolutely right. I forgot my colleagues at Duxford.
He's just Dutch.
I'll have to play this for them.
Run it again and we'll ask the question. I'll tell you there's 4.
There are just over 1,000 made?
Just under 1,000.
And today there are?
Only 4 remaining.
So what happened to all the 996 or thereabouts?
Aircraft go through a period of being the most modern, the most attractive and the most wanted. They then mature in service, they then become old and slightly less fashionable, and they're passed down to smaller air forces. When they get rid of them, they become old, obsolete and unwanted. usually that means they're scrapped for a few cents on the pound by weight of material. If they survive for perhaps 15 or 20 years as a derelict hulk somewhere, then often they then assume a value again, and vintage warbird enthusiasts both in North America and in Europe will scour the world for these hulks to be brought back and refurbished and rebuilt.
Was the duty drawn by the crew of this type of a plane? Was it a happy duty? I mean, did they enjoy getting duty on a seaplane, or was it looked down upon?
It's difficult to say. The problem with all war, whether you're talking about land forces, naval forces or air forces, is that for most of the time it's boring. Nothing's happening, it's routine. You're marching backwards and forwards, you're in the cookhouse. This was a very long range, long endurance flying aircraft, nearly 24 hours endurance. It has a galley on board so you can prepare hot food. It has bunks on board so you can get a rest. But you are confined. Could I ask the question of you, do you really enjoy a 23-hour flight in a jumbo jet?
No way.
This is considerably more noisy.
Had far fewer of the attractions of your commercial airliner, yes.
No sweet peanuts,
Well,
beverage service, flight attendants.
it didn't have that. Some of the cooks were particularly imaginative, however. During the early part of the war, one of the last-ditch communication systems that we had was to provide crews with pigeons. And the Australians, for example, had the highest loss of pigeons of any force operated under Royal Air Force Command. There is a suspicion that many of these actually went into the Galley, but I can't confirm that.
You're a natural at this. About this aircraft behind us, from the period it left service with the RAF, briefly, could you tell us a little bit about it? Did it have any interesting journeys from that point to where it sits now, or was it pretty much a museum piece all the time?
The aircraft was surplus to the RAF's requirements after the war. It was put into storage and then it was sold to the French. It went out to the Pacific, and in the early 60s, after it had been withdrawn from French service, it was brought back to the United Kingdom and formed a small single aircraft museum. Unfortunately, small museums dealing with only one subject often are non-economic, and that tended to be the case with this particular Sunderland Trust. Therefore, in 1971, the Royal Air Force Museum absorbed that trust and its assets, which consisted of the aircraft, into the collection, and we've been proud to have the aircraft with us ever since.
So it has pretty much remained in military specs all of its entire life.
This aircraft remained in military service. It was never converted for a civilian purpose.
And let me pause for a minute.
What do you call the
The inspection
engines?
panels, yes.
Inspection panels?
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the inspection panels for the on either side of the engine?
Stand by. Gary, are you going to lunch? This is our carpenter.
Stand over here a little bit. Or is he in the right place? Okay. All right. Pick up whenever you want.
The problem with an aircraft that uses the sea, or water particularly, is that of course you can't easily maintain it unless you pull it out of the water, and that's not always practical. So this aircraft has got some built-in inspection panels where crews can actually stand, engineers can inspect the engines, service the engines. One of the other problems, of course, is that they need to tie their tools in such a way, if you drop a spanner and you're moored on water, it goes down to the bottom, can't be recovered. I think the model on the other side, if you haven't filmed it, actually has got the tie loop on there. That's white, like that.
Were there inspection panels just on either side of both engines?
On the leading edges of the wing, on both sides of the engines, yes.
I believe also, isn't there an access way from the inside of the aircraft out into the wing and to behind the engines?
You can indeed crawl through the wing to the rear of the engines. I have done it once. It is claustrophobic. I don't really recommend it.
And just for the record, could you state your full name and your affiliation here?
I'm Richard Simpson, the keeper of aircraft at the Royal Air Force Museum, Hendon, London.
Give us permission to use this in a demonstration tape for the possibility of producing a full-length, high-quality documentary on the flying boats.
This is indeed an interview based on the statement, it is a pilot only, and if any further filming is to be done, it will be scripted and we will have sight of the script before the interview.
Okay.
I think that's
Anything else?
all that I can think of.
And we've now got a new...
The fact that it lands on water. So what is the fascination connected with the Sunderland and flying boats in general?
Many of our visitors are fascinated by the Sunderland flying boat because of its sheer size. They either like the largest or the smallest.
Okay, I guess that's it.
As window. Further back on both sides you can see 4.303 caliber Browning machine guns. These were fired by the pilot, usually to keep enemy gunners' heads down. Welcome aboard this Sunderland flying boat. Your tour begins shortly. Please mind your head. The Sunderland was a long-range anti-submarine patrol aircraft. In this forward section, underneath the gun turret at the front, is the bomb aimer's window. Further back, on both sides, you can see 4.303 caliber Browning machine guns. These were fired by the pilot, usually to keep enemy gunners' heads down. Between them, you can see the anchor with its chain and winch. Remember, flying boats operate from water, not land. Sunderland patrols often lasted for more than 12 hours, so some home comforts were necessary, including a toilet. The stairs in the centre lead up to the cockpit. Overhead is an inspection hatch, which has been opened to allow you to stand up and see the pilot's positions and the back of the instrument panel. Again, we remind you to mind your head. Go towards the rear of the aircraft, through the narrow doorway and down 2 steps. Stop when you next hear my voice.
Thanks.
Welcome aboard this Sunderland flying boat. You are now in the crew rest area, with its 2 bunk seats and folding table. During their long patrols, this is where the crew members, in shifts, would rest and eat. Move on through the next area, the galley, where food was prepared. Look out for the compact black paraffin stove with its small oven. The ladder leads to the upper deck crew positions where you can see the flight engineer's seat. Please walk on, stopping when you next hear my voice. Remember, flying boats operate forward section. Underneath the gun turret at the front is the bomb aimer's window. Further back on both sides, you are now in the crew rest area, with its 2 bunk seats and folding table. During their long patrols, this is where the crew members, in shifts, would rest and eat. Move on through the next area, the galley, where food was prepared. Look out for the compact black paraffin stove with its small oven. The ladder leads to the upper deck crew positions where you can see the flight engineer's seat. Please walk on, stopping when you next hear my voice. You're now in the bomb compartment. High on both sides, you can see the bomb racks, where up to 1 ton of bombs, depth charges, or mines could be carried on each patrol. The bombs, or in this case depth charges, are cranked out as they would be prior to an attack on a submarine. Normally, they would be stowed in the racks, and the hatches marked parachute exit would be tightly shut. These doubled as one of the escape routes for the crew if the aircraft had to be abandoned. Now walk to the rear of the aircraft. Mind your head as you go through the low doorway and up the staircase. During their long patrols, this is where the crew members, in shifts, would rest and eat. You're now in the bomb compartment. Bombs, or in this case depth charges, are cranked out as they would be prior to an attack on a submarine. Normally, they would be stowed in the racks, and the hatches marked parachute exit would be... You're now in the bomb compartment. High on both sides, you can see the bomb racks, where up to 1 ton of bombs, depth charges, or had to be abandoned. Now walk to the rear of the aircraft. Mind your head as you go through the low doorway and up the staircase. You're now in the bomb compartment. So when minor repairs to equipment became necessary, they could be carried out in flight. One of the escape routes for the crew. If you look each side of the aircraft, you can see 2 large hatches. These are the waist gun positions, and hell point fire. 5 points right through the aircraft to the cockpit windows. This completes your visit to the RAF Museum Sunderland Flying Boat. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please now leave by the rear door, mind your head, and take care on the exit staircase. The floor in this area gently rises towards the tail of the aircraft. The figure you can see is the rear gunner, and behind him is the rear turret. Opposite the exit door is a small workbench and vise. This is in fact part of the standard fitting of the aircraft, so when minor repairs to equipment became necessary, they could be carried out in flight. If you look each side of the aircraft, you can see two large hatches. These are the waist gun positions and held .5-inch Browning machine guns. By late 1943, Sunderland aircraft carried as many as 18 defensive guns, earning it the nickname the Flying Porcupine. Look towards the upper deck of the standard fitting of the aircraft, so when minor repairs to equipment became necessary, they could be carried out in flight. If you look each side of the aircraft, you can see two large hatches. These are the waist gun positions and held .5-inch Browning machine guns. By late 1943, Sunderland aircraft carried as many as 18 defensive guns, earning it the nickname the Flying Porcupine. Look towards the upper deck and you can see right through the aircraft to the cockpit windows. This completes your visit to the RAF Museum Sunderland Flying Boat. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please now leave by the rear door, mind your head, and take care on the exit staircase. The figure you can see is the rear gunner, and behind him is the rear turret. Opposite the exit door is a small workbench and vise. The Sunderland was a long-range anti-submarine patrol aircraft. In this forward section, underneath the gun turret at the front, is the bomb aimer's window. Further back, on both sides, you can see 4.303 caliber Browning machine guns. These were fired by the pilot, usually to keep enemy gunners' heads down. Between them, you can see the anchor with its chain and winch. Remember, flying boats operate from water, not land. The stairs in the center lead up to the cockpit. Overhead is an inspection hatch, which has been opened to allow you to stand up and see the pilot's position. Normally they would be stowed in the racks, and the hatches marked parachute exit would be tightly shut. These doubled as one of the escape routes for the crew if the aircraft had to be abandoned. Now walk to the rear of the aircraft. Mind your head as you go through the low doorway and up the staircase. You're now in the bomb compartment. High on both sides, you can see the bomb racks, where up to 1 ton of bombs, depth charges, or mines could be carried on each patrol. The bomb, you can see two large hatches. These are the waist gun positions and held .5-inch Browning machine guns. By late 1943, Sunderland Flying Boat. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please now leave by the rear door, mind your head, and take care on the exit staircase.
Here we go.
It's just there's so many shadows and reflections in the glass. Time.
Thought you're not recording. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
To get all that information on recorded.
Yeah, should
Even
have.
if the camera's not point light on the front of the camera.
No, you can cover it up with tape.
Or covered up. There you go. And that way you can still put together a video and stuff. You don't want him just standing there going, yes, they created 749 and 4 left. That type of stuff.
Right.
I mean, that's the type of stuff to me that I would sit there and chuckle, you know, and learn at the same time. It's a lot
course.
more entertaining.
I wouldn't be able to use that because basically we're recording it without his permission or knowledge.
Although you could use the information. Yeah. Get free. But it's amazing how much he clammed up.
Yeah.
He started. If we see that happening again with somebody else, we're going to say, you know, just feel free to be yourself. Just talk to us, you know. He was second in command at the beginning of the war, and he was the guy that was rumored to have. Preservation board. All the preservation boards in, I think, 9 cities in Florida were canceled this year. Eliminated. Whole bureau was cut from the budget.
Radio operators, navigator station. Excuse me. Open cockpits. Forward thingamajig.
Were they F-15s? 14s?
14. There's a tornado. On Avia. This is an old Halifax they pulled out of a fjord in Norway. One of the planes that took part in the bombing of the Tirpitz.